I point out in my book that when 1984 was first published in the late 40s, it was understood to be really like a work of science fiction, a dystopian novel about the not-too-distant future and how the great authoritarianisms that emerged from in the mid-20th centuries might come to power, absolute power. But there's a way to understand 1984 as a book about the Inquisition, or at least that inquisitorial toolbox, because all of the hallmarks of 1984 were present 600 years earlier in the earliest incarnation of the Inquisition. As I've already said, Orwell uses the term thought police. The thought police is a perfect term to describe the so-called friar inquisitors, the Dominican and Franciscan monks who were the shock troops of the Inquisition. They were not punishing acts. They were not punishing wrongful acts. They were punishing only wrongful thoughts. There are other hallmarks of the Inquisition that show up in 1984, including the violence to language, which refuses to call anything by its rightful name. Thank you. So that, and this is the Orwellian idea of newspeak. Love is hate, war is peace. This playing with language to conceal the real motive and the real conduct of an authoritarian power is something borrowed from the Inquisition as well. The most famous example that I can give you is the term auto de fe, which we come down to us to indicate what it really was, the ceremony, great public spectacle at which convicted heretics were burned to death in front of a crowd, a very enthusiastic crowd. This has come to be called an auto de fe. In fact, the auto de fe referred to the whole spectacle itself, which included a great deal of public ritual and display, heraldry, and of performance, culminating in the execution of prisoners. But it literally means only an act of faith. Auto de fe means act of faith. This was the pious fiction embraced by the Inquisition, that they were doing God's work. They were demonstrating their faith in the universal, the Catholic Church, by punishing these dissonant Christians. That's an example of Orwellian newspeak way back in the Middle Ages, and we find similar examples down through history. I want to pause and go into tight focus on what heresy really amounted to in the history of the Inquisition. And I'm going to use as my favorite example one of the heresies charged against the Cathars. Now, this is a particularly tragic episode in history. The Cathars were Christians who read their Gospels. That in itself was heretical, as I've already pointed out. They weren't supposed to be reading that Bible. They were supposed to be letting the priest mediate it to them. But they noticed in the Gospels that Jesus was depicted as being poor, powerless, and homeless. And his disciples were being depicted as poor, powerless, and homeless. The sparrow has a nest, but the Son of God has nowhere to lay his head. The disciples who were sent out by Jesus, according to the Gospels, were to beg the food they ate and the shelter where they slept night by night. It was a religious culture of poverty. And they compared that to the Catholic Church as it existed in the High Middle Ages, which was sheer opulence. The high clergy were known as princes of the church, and not just for self-praise. They were princes in every real sense. They lived opulent and comfortable lives. And so the Cathars were kind of rigorists and ascetics, and we would call them today fundamentalists, who advocated a purer and simpler form of Christianity, and by doing so were impliedly and sometimes explicitly condemning the corruptions of the medieval church. The church itself, under Pope Gregory, admitted that this was true. They admitted that there were excesses in the church and tried to reform itself. The Cathars were reformers who took it upon themselves to live simpler Christian lives. That was their heresy. That's what the church objected to. In precisely the same document in which the Inquisition was first defined as a legal entity, this is a document of 1215 called the Canons of the Fourth Lateran Council. It was a legal document. This was the Constitution, the founding document of the Inquisition. It was also a document in which the Pope announced that good Christians had to believe a brand new dogma that didn't appear in the Bible and had not been part of Catholic dogma beforehand, the doctrine known to us as transubstantiation. A good Christian must accept as a correct belief, an orthodoxy, the doctrine of transubstantiation. Well, what's that? During the communion ritual in church, where just as we make a motzi and they would have a wafer, a communion wafer, and communion wine, and they were instructed by the Pope in 1215 that a good Christian embraces the idea, this is just an idea, that at the moment of the communion ceremony, that wafer is miraculously and literally changed from flour and water to the body, the flesh of Jesus. And that the wine becomes not fermented grape juice, but the blood, the pumping blood of Jesus. This is a miracle that was meant to be earnestly embraced by good Catholics. Now, the Cathars rejected this, among other things, and they believed that it was an impious thought. They could not understand how a true Christian could hold such a thought in their mind. And they pointed out that if, in fact, you did believe that the wafer and the wine were the body and blood of Christ, it meant that the next time you went to the privy, you were excreting God into the toilet. And at a point when the inquisitors were still engaging in disputations, public disputations, they later gave up on that. The braver Cathars would make this argument to their faces. My point here is that heresy is always a moving target. Heresy is failing to believe in the thing that the person in power tells you you must believe in at any given time and place. And dogma changes. This was a brand new dogma. But that was the whole of the crime of heresy. There was not an act of heresy, there was only a thought that was deemed heretical. And it was only the thought that was punished. Now, we know another example, and in many ways it's an even more chilling example, and certainly more relatable example to a bunch of Jews. We don't get involved in communion. And that's the example of Galileo. Again, I think the most famous victim of the Inquisition. And a rather late victim. I mean, he's in the 17th century, the 1600s. Galileo was a scientist. He was a man of science. He was an astronomer. He tested hypotheses by scientific experiment and was one of the great proponents of the scientific method, at a time when the church was still clinging to these medieval ideas about dogma. Now, his famous notion, it was not even his notion, it was Copernicus' notion, was that contrary to the received wisdom of centuries, the sun did not revolve around the earth. He proposed the idea that the earth revolved around the sun. This thought was a heresy. And for holding this thought and publishing a book about it, again, there's no act here except the mental act of saying perhaps it's wrong to say that the sun revolves around the earth, perhaps we revolve around the sun. For that crime, that Orwellian thought crime, at the age of 72, nearly blind, he was arrested and brought before the Inquisition and charged with the crime of heresy. Now, when you have a thought crime, the way you absolve yourself of the crime is to simply withdraw the bad thought. You recant your heresy, and you embrace the dogma of the church. That was acceptable under most circumstances throughout the history of the Inquisition. If you conceded that you were wrong and the church was right, you might still be punished, but you wouldn't be put to death. One of the things that is not often reflected upon and is very important to consider is that Galileo did not resist the Inquisition. He did not martyr himself for the sake of scientific truth or freedom of thought. Galileo went down on his knees in a penitent's shirt and confessed to the crime of heresy.